now. All right, so please watch the past video if you have not done so already. Again, that's just if you go to communication, then click Zoom here, right? If you click Zoom, then it says this cloud recordings. Doesn't look exactly the same thing as mine does because I have some more crap on here, but you click cloud recordings, then you'll see it. Okay. If at any time you do not see it and you think it should be there, then that means I have to go in here and click this. Does everybody see that? This is really stupid. I don't know why it doesn't automatically publish, but it does not. Okay. It takes a little while for it to compile. Once it compiles, of course, I'll publish it, but I don't know when it compiles. Does that make sense? So if like tomorrow you start looking at it, you don't see it there, send me an email and then I'll go and fix it. Okay. All right. So someone had asked a question about discrete and continuous. Also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a couple of problems just associated with some things that I think people have some difficulty with and how to use the calculator a little bit. This is a little redundant. It will be some of the same things that are on the videos already. Does that understand? But I want to give you some more examples. Okay. We won't always be doing this, all right? It's just that I told you there were some things I wanted to add on one of the videos there. That's what I'm doing now. Does that make sense? All right. Someone brought up this idea of discrete versus continuous. And this was something that should have been on your homework that was actually, I believe, due today, I think. All right. But we're going to talk about this again, actually, when we get to chapter 5. All right. So we talk about it a little bit right now, but really it's just vocabulary. Later on, we're going to have to do some math associated with it a little bit more. So we're going to get into it a little bit more. There's more videos about it. All right. But discrete versus continuous, what they want us to do is they want us to understand for a variable, what would be the difference between these two, or how do we classify something as discrete? How do we classify something as continuous? Okay. Does anybody know? Has anybody ever heard these words before? Go ahead. Okay. Let's say it this way. All right. So continuous means it's really more about like the possible values that you can get for something, these two things. All right. What are the possibilities that you can get? All right. So a continuous data type or a continuous variable, all right, means that all values over a range of values are possible. Or sometimes people say an interval of values. In other words, for instance, let's say I said someone's going to walk in here randomly, the next person, whoever it is, right? And we wanted to say what their height would be, right? I mean, I don't know how short they could be. Let's pretend someone could be 2 feet tall. And let's say they could be as large as 9 feet tall. Okay, obviously that's a little too small and a little too big, but we're just going to pretend to try and encompass everything. Does that make sense? But then like anything here would be possible also. Is that right? Like you could be like 2.75434 feet. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Any decimal. Is that right? Question? I'm not guessing. What are the possible things? Just what could it be? Does that make sense? All right. Now, discrete though means there's sort of like gaps between the possibilities. So like if I say to you, let's say there's a basketball game on tonight, and we want to say, there's our favorite player in the game, whatever that player is, right? So let's say we all pick one player. So one individual, right? And then we want to say how many baskets this guy makes or girl makes tonight. Does that make sense? Well, they could make 0, right? They could miss everything or just not take a shot, right? They could make 1. They could make 2, right? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then I don't know how high it could go. Does that make sense? But it would have to be only one of these numbers. Like there's a gap here. Is that correct? Between the possibilities? Does that make sense? Not necessarily. I'll give you an example with decimals in a second. It's a good question though. All right. So but there has to be a gap between the possible numbers. Does that make sense? All right. Right. You can't get 0.5 field goals in the game. Is that right? Does that make sense? How many dollar bills do you have in your wallet? You're not having half of a dollar bill. Is that correct? You have 0, 1, 2, 3. It's random. If we were to randomly select someone, how much they have. Does that make sense? But it's not continuous. Can you give me an example of a continuous variable? Temperature would be a good example. Does that make sense? Temperature could be anything between a range of numbers. Is that right? Any decimal is possible. Is that correct? It's not like you can't say it's 72.5 degrees. You can say that. Is that correct? You can also say it's 72.946753451 whatever, right? Okay. How many phone calls are made to New York from Florida on Thanksgiving? Would that be discrete or continuous? Discrete. There's gaps between the possibilities. Is that correct? Does it make sense, guys? Question with us? All right. This is supposed to be data from some sort of fast food restaurant. And the fast food restaurant, they're measuring how long people were waiting and then the number of people that waited those times. Does everybody see that? This is called a frequency distribution. And this is actually on the videos. I already talked about this on the videos you're already supposed to watch. Does that make sense? All right. Now, the thing is a lot of times what will be asked is they'll ask us, like, what's the average? And this is also on the videos, this calculation that I'm doing right now. I just want to do it again to try to introduce the calculator and make sure people pay attention to it. Does that make sense? All right. Does anybody know what the formula is for average? That's correct. So we write it like this. We say X bar is equal to, and then I write the sum of the X values from I equals 1 to N and divide this by N. This means X1 plus X2 plus X3 plus however many numbers there are. And then we divide that by the number of numbers. So it just means add them all up and divide, right? I believe I mentioned this in the videos also, okay? So then this is just notation, all right? Because otherwise it's hard to write out all this stuff. So write it like this. This just tells you where you start. This tells you where you end. Question? No, I was just saying it's X bar. All right. So then this, you add up all the numbers and you divide by however many there are. Has everybody seen that? But it's confusing here what to add up. Why? These 14 people here, it's saying they got somewhere between 0 and 3. I don't know what they got. Does that make sense? They could have all got 0. They could have all got 3. Or they could have got something else, right? So what are we going to do? I share this in the video, so. We talk about the class center or class midpoint or class mark, right? We need to associate a number with this stuff. Does that make sense? Right? So like, I don't know what these people got, but I say in the videos, this is called a lower class limit and this is called an upper class limit. And then what I said was that if you wanted to determine a representative value for the particular class, what we would do is take the average of these numbers. Does that make sense? All right. So 0 plus 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. 4 plus 7 divided by 2 is 5.5. 3. So you keep adding 4. So this is 9.5, 13.5, 17.5, 21.5, and 25.5. Okay. Now I have a representative number that I'm going to use to represent those people in each of those classes. Does that make sense? So these 14 people, I'm just going to pretend like they all waited 1.5 minutes because I have nothing better that I can say. I have to pick the average. The average is the most likely thing. Does that make sense? All right. So what do I start adding up then? 14. What do you mean? What add up all what? So what do I add? What do I start adding? So 1.5 plus 5.5 plus 9.5 plus 13.5, like that? Is that correct? Adding these up, is this correct? What, I add all these up and then divide by what? Is that right? No? Why not? Multiply them by the number of customers is correct. Why is this wrong, the way I'm doing it right now? Because there's way more than 7 people. Are there only 7 customers here? There's way more than 7. Is that right, guys? The average waiting time, we got to add up all the customers' waiting times. Is that correct? So how many people are there here? Yeah. So if I say the sum of the frequencies here is 61, does everybody see that? This should be 61 down here. Is that right? Does that make sense? Now, 1.5 doesn't really just occur once, right? It occurs 14 times. Is that right? So it should be 14 times this. It should be 13 times this, right? 14 times this. 8 times that guy. 6 times that guy. 3 times that one. And 3 times that one. Is that right? Does that make sense, guys? Sometimes people write this formula instead like this: the sum of Fi times Xi over sum Fi. Because I can think of this as F1, X1, right? This is the frequency, and this is the value. This is the frequency, and this is the value. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Calculate this, see what you get. There's another way I can rewrite this. What are these called? This was in your video also. By the way, I'm just telling you this because these things are gonna be on your test. And they gonna be on your next test. And they gonna be on your next test. And they gonna be on the final. You gotta know what these things are. I'm trying to make sure that you understand that you have to understand what's going on in all these videos. Does that make sense? Otherwise, you're gonna go take that test, and the first test, the easiest one, and you don't do well on that first test, there's virtually no chance you're gonna do well in the rest of the class. Unless you just haven't tried. But if you try, you should do well on that first test. Does that make sense? What are these things called? This is like one of the first things they say in the damn video. Frequency distribution is the whole thing. These are called relative frequencies. The frequency divided by the total, is that correct? The percentage of something falling in each class, is that right? In other words, this is another way we can write the formula. We can say that this is the, sometimes they'll say like PI or the percentage times XI. Sometimes people call this also a weighted average. Because you're weighting each value based off how often it occurs. Does that make sense? Like this one occurs more often than this one. So 3 out of 61 versus 14 out of 61. Does everybody see that? Question with this? What's the answer? What's the numerical result? Is that what everybody got? So This is just, I was just writing it out again somewhere else. But I need you to know how to use this stupid calculator. First of all, you had to pay for it. Second of all, there's a reason why we're saying to use this. Because if you don't know how to use this thing, it's just causing way too many problems. Does that make sense? All right, so if I push clear, it clears this thing. You really don't use very many buttons on this calculator in this class. We just use like stat and distar, really. Those are the only two buttons, really. All right. If we click stat, this takes us to this thing called the editor. If I push enter here, this is the editor. It's like a spreadsheet, right? So if you go up to the top here, now if you push delete, it'll delete one element from the list. Does everybody see that? But if I push delete here, the whole stupid list is gone. Does that make sense? That's kind of bad. If that happens, you have to push setup editor and then push enter, and then the list will be back. Does everybody see that? But if I want to actually remove the things from the list, I have to go up to the top and push clear. Push clear, then I push enter, and they're gone. All right? Clear, enter, and they're gone. Does everybody see that? All right, I'm going to enter this data into this thing. Does that make sense? Now, I would, if I was doing the question, I would just enter this and this. These are my X values, and these are my frequencies. Has everybody seen that? But I'm going to pretend like I didn't do that, and I'm just going to show you how to use the calculator also, okay? But I'm just telling you, I really wouldn't do all of this if I was doing the problem. Does that make sense? All right. So the first set of numbers are what? 0, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and 24. All right? Also, there's another thing that people always screw up on this, and this tells me, honestly, if you're doing anything. All right? Because if someone's going to ask me this in like 2 weeks, and then someone's going to ask me this again in 2 weeks, all right? It just shows me the person's not doing any of their homework, honestly. All right? But if you want to type negative number in here, you can't use this thing to do negative. It doesn't work. All right. If you do -3, it's going to be like, yo, it don't work. Syntax. Syntax means how we write stuff. Does that make sense? So if I go to here, it tells me, oh, it's happening right there. That's my problem. Does that make sense? But if I change it to this thing, the opposite symbol, then it's like, oh, it's fine. Does that make sense? All right. So I'm just be careful with that. Okay. Everybody makes a mistake on that eventually. Does that make sense? All right. I do say that in the videos also. Okay. So then here, now what I need to do is all of the upper class limits are really just 3 more than these. Is that right? So I don't want to type them all in again. It's a calculator. It should be able to do it. Does that make sense? So if I go up here to this L2 thing, that's called the list variable. Does that make sense? If I push enter, it takes me to here. And it's like, what does L2 equal to, right? Well, if you see on here, it says L1. Does everybody see that? So if I do second 1, and then I push +3, it's going to take each element in L1 and add 3 to it, and then put that in L2. Does that make sense? Boom. Does everybody see that? Question with that? Again, I'm just showing you how to use it. It doesn't really matter that much in this case. If you just type them in, it's not going to save you that much time, right? I'm just showing you how to use it. Any question? All right, here. Now, to do anything in this class, you need values and how often they're occurring. That's called a frequency distribution, right? We always need that. Does that make sense? The calculator is going to expect it when it wants to calculate something. It's like, yo, what's the values? Yo, how often do they occur, right? Where's the X list? Where's the frequency list? Okay, I need to give it to the calculator somewhere, all right? Well, that means I need to make this X list here. Again, I could just take these numbers and plug them in. But before, what I said was, we're going to take the value in L1, the lower class limit, the value in L2, the upper class limit, and we're going to take the average of those two things. Is that right? So I can do that on the calculator also. I'm just going to show you. Does that make sense? All right, so if I go in here, I push enter. Now, I want to add these up, then divide by 2. So I'm going to use parentheses, right? So parentheses, the thing coming from the L1 plus the thing coming from the L2, close parentheses. Does everybody see that? Divide by duper. Find their average. Is that correct? Boom. Does that make sense? Question with this? So now here, these are the corresponding values that we're considering from each of these classes. This is a representative value, right? Expected value. So then this, we write now their respective frequencies. And now I have a frequency distribution. This part right here is my frequency distribution. Does everybody see that? These are the X's, and then these are their respective frequencies. Is that correct? That's all you ever need to do. There's like one function in the first chapter that answers like 70% of the questions on your first exam. All you ever need to be able to do is find the X's and find the frequencies and understand what they mean in terms of the problem. Does that make sense? You cannot tell me it's hard, to be honest. All right? It's not. Not yet. Does that make sense? Make sure you watch these videos. If I had to guess, out of the people in here right now, how many people have watched the 2 videos that we were supposed to have watched? I'm going to guess 2. How many people out of those 2 people have watched the videos and retained everything, or enough to do their exam? I'm going to say 0. That's okay. You haven't done your homework yet. Does that make sense? You haven't gotten through all of it yet. All right. But we got to move. Does that make sense? All right. Because you got a test next week. Okay. But it's not that bad, honestly, the first stuff. It's a lot of sections, but it's easy to do. The next chapter, it's not that many sections. It's a little bit more difficult. There's more calculations. Does that make sense? All right. Question here so far? But there's one main function that you have to know how to do for your first exam. All right. And believe it or not, we're going to keep using that throughout the entire course. There's going to be a question on your final that gives you the answer in 1 second. All right. Once you know how to do it. Does that make sense? All right. But quite often, you're given a bunch of data and you have to take that data and plug it into the computer. All right, great. I did that. Right. Then you actually want some statistics. You actually want to describe it some way and calculate something about it. They call that descriptive statistics. Does that make sense? Like the mean, the median, the maximum, the minimum. Does that make sense? Something to give me a little bit of information. All right. So now I got to remember where I put these stupid things. Oh, the X's are in L3 and the frequencies are in L4. Does everybody see that? All right. So now, again, I told you there's only really like 2 buttons we're going to use, stat and dister. And dister, we don't even get to that until chapter 5, right? So really, it's just this stat thing for now. All you have to know is how to type this stuff in there and how to calculate something. And I'm about to show you how to calculate it, all right? So we click stat. Now, again, I like thinking about things as if I don't know shit. Because quite often, I forget everything. I don't use the calculator for a little while. I forget where everything is. Does that make sense? But I have to be able to go in there and figure it out somehow when I've forgotten, because you're not going to remember it all the time, right? So when you look at this stuff, we got to start trying to reason our way through these buttons and stuff like that into what means what and where we're going to go with it, right? Edit, I think we know what that means. Is that correct? Edit the list, put the stuff in the list. Is that right? Sort A. If I give it a list, what it's going to do is sort them in ascending order. Does that make sense? You're almost never going to use it, but that's what that'll do. Does that make sense? Sort D, that will sort in descending order. All right. Clear list, you don't need to use this because I told you just use clear over here. You just go up to the top and push clear. Is that correct? Setup editor, that one you might have to use because if we push delete by accident and the list start disappearing, we got a problem. We can't use the calculator anymore. Does that make sense? All right. Now, if you had a guess, where are we going to go? Try to get these answers for the average. Where do you think I'd go here? Yeah. It says calc up there, right? So let's push right and we go over here. Does everybody see that? Now, One var stats means statistics associated with one variable. Two var stats means statistics associated with two variables, right? And we don't use the rest of this stuff, okay? Which one do you think is going to be? One variable, we only have one in this case. Because we only have the waiting times. Does that make sense? All right. The tests here, we talk about this stuff, chapter 7, exam 5. All right. So we're not going to get to that for a while. Has everybody seen that? Calculate. All right. One var stats. That's the only thing you got to know how to do. Good. I push enter. Does everybody see that? Then it says list and it says freak list. And this is not like Rick James freak. No, this is not like frequency. Does everybody see that? So this is the list of frequencies. This is the list of X values. Does everybody see that? The things you need for a frequency distribution. All right. Where did I put this list? Oh, this was in L3. Above the 3 here. Let me see if I can just zoom in a little bit. Above the 3 here, if you push second, it gives you L3. Does everybody see that? And then L4, L5, L6, they have them here just easier for you. Does that make sense? You shouldn't need more than 3 of them anyway. Does that make sense? All right, so I go there, L3, freak list, L4, right? You push enter, and it gave me the answer. Does that make sense? 9.5 is the average. This is the sum of the X values. This is the sum of the squares of the X values. This is something called the sample standard deviation, which is on a video you're supposed to watch for this weekend. Does that make sense? Tells you how spread out things are, right? This is the population standard deviation. This is something that tells you how spread out things are, but for the overall distribution, not just for a sample. N is the sample size, or the number of total values in the sample. Remember, we had 61. It counted them for us. Did you ever see that? Minimum X value, Q1 median, Q3 maximum X value. Minimum X value is 1.5. That was the smallest thing in our data set, right? Does that make sense? Maximum X value was 25.5. That was the largest thing in our data set. The median value, it says, is 9.5. So the worst thing you would have to do to calculate the median of something is type the data. Does that make sense? Question? Any question on anything so far? All right, we're going to come back to this in a second. I want to go over percentiles. All right. To be honest, you should know what this means without me telling you, to be honest. But very few people do. What does percentile mean? If you know. What does it mean if you're in the 88th percentile or something? What do you mean? What were you gonna say? Close. Go. So what does it mean, I guess, like if I get an 88% on the test versus being in the 88th percentile? Like I'm kind of asking, like, what's the difference between those two things? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Close, but no. 88% of the people did worse than your ass. 88% got less than you. Does that make sense? If you're in the 88th percentile. This means I got 88% of the questions right on the test. Is that correct? This means I did better than 88% of the people. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? All right, so percentile means the percentage of values less than the value of interest. So if I want to calculate the percentile, what I do is all right, it's like the number of values less than the value that you're talking about divided by the total number of values. Does that make sense? So it's like the fraction of things less than you. You guys get it? All right, so a couple questions. Can you be in the 0th percentile? If so, how? What would you say? You can't be in the 0th percentile? Why not? Why? Can you be in the 0th percentile? Yes, how? If you're the lowest, you're in the 0th percentile because there are 0 people lower than you. Does that make sense? So it would be like 0 over whatever. Does that make sense? 0 divided by something is still 0. So yes, you get the lowest score. Okay. Can you be in the 100th percentile? How? You cannot be in the 100th percentile. Why not? Don't give me that. Don't give me that Michelle face. Well, you want to, I mean, we want to try to be the highest, right? Obviously, right? To try to be better than 100% of the people. But I'm saying no, it doesn't work. Why? Go ahead. What do you mean? Sort of. That's correct. So, like, the problem is if there's like 1,000 people, and let's say I get the top score, right? What would my percentile be? Then it would be 999 people I did better than. I can't do better than myself. Is that correct? And then 1,000, and then we end up getting 99.9%. Is that correct? But we don't get 100. Does everybody see that? Because it's the number less than me. I can never be bigger than and myself. Does that make sense? Question with this? All right, so percentiles, percent means breaking things up into 100 parts, right? Century, cent, is that correct? So like percentiles are like, oh, you could have like P0, you could have P1, you could have P2, P3, blah, 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 blah. P99. Does everybody see that? But P100 kind of doesn't make any sense. You could round up to it. but we can't exactly be in the 100th percentile. Does that make sense? All right, but they do say that there's these other ones that we could also get. All right. Actually, let's just leave this alone for a second. We'll do the question. All right, question with this so far? So what we would kind of want to do is kind of figure out where someone belongs with respect to these things. Do they belong in the first percentile? Do they belong in the second percentile? Do they belong in the third percentile, etc.? Right? Right. Find the percentile for the data value. Data value 6 given this data set. What would you say? Explain me, please. How are you going to do this? Correct. So try to always figure out the overall total first, right? So then this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, it looks like. Is that right? So then what do I do? So what is that? So what is it? I think I got 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Is that right? So the percentile for the data value 6 is going to have to equal to 7 divided by 20. Is that right? 7 of the values are less than this number. So the fraction less than it is 7 over 20, which is what, 35%? Is that correct? So we would say that P35 is 6. Does that make sense? Count the number that are less than it, divide by the total. Fong. I'm just telling you. Also, I see a couple people doing this with taking the pictures. I don't mind if you take the pictures. I don't care. All right. But I'm just telling you, it is a bad way to study. Okay. Why is it a bad way to study? Because I'm going to post a video online. So you go watch it. All right. Second thing is that it's hard to go through photos. It's hard to keep all the photos and actually go through them. All right. Try if you can, whenever we're doing these things, it doesn't matter what class you're in, try and write it down. Does that make sense? Because if you write it down, it reinforces it just a little bit more. And then you might not have to waste your time with it later. Does that make sense? All right. That's one of the things that recently, over the past like 5 years, people have become absolute shit at taking notes. Nobody takes notes anymore. All right. But you'd be surprised how much it's messing up people's memories. All right. Question? Use the classwork. Use the classwork. Yeah. Is 6 less than 6? But is 6 less than 6? No. So it doesn't satisfy. Does that make sense? All right. So this definition here, the way I wrote it, I just said the number of values less than, right? So if I say the number of values less than 6, we wouldn't count 6, right? 6 is not less than 6. All right. The number of 32 students are listed below. Find Q3. Anybody know what Q3 means? They say the third quartile, but quarter 3, same thing. What does that mean? What do you say? 1 over 2? Okay. How about 3 over 4? Okay. So Q3 is the exact same thing as P75. All right. The third quarter is the 75th percentile. Is that correct? Third quartile. All right. So we call these things quartiles. There's something called the 5-number summary, which your calculator actually just gave me before here. this, this, and this. This is called the 5-number summary. Does that make sense? Because like when you type a whole bunch of data in the computer, it's helpful to get this 5-number summary and then get an idea of the distribution of data. Does that make sense? So you want to know the minimum, the 25th percentile. What's the median in terms of percentiles? 50th percentile. The median has 50% lower than it and 50% greater than it. Does that make sense? The P75 is Q3, same thing. Okay. Damn it. All right, so the quartiles, the 5-number summary is the minimum, Q1, Q2, Q3, and then the maximum. Sometimes people call the Q2 the median. You could also call it the 50th percentile. Those are all the same thing. Does that make sense? So these quartiles, if we take the data set, 25% of the data falls below Q1. 25% would fall between Q1 and Q2. 25% falls between Q2 and Q3. And then 25% falls between Q3 and the maximum. Does that make sense? Question with this so far? All right, so how would I find Q3 here? Almost everyone gets this wrong the first time they do it. What do you mean? What value? What numbers? What are you talking about? They're already in order. Which one? What would you do though? Tell me.
Like the last set, I think if I didn't find like the last set, that last set you find
Okay. How though? So like, what am I doing? So what if you divide by half, what do you get? Like, what do you mean? You gotta tell me something with some numbers. Like you're just speaking in words. You're not showing me that you can actually do anything.
Oh, you want to
Yeah. Because what you're saying, some of the things you're saying are definitely correct. But if you show me you could do it, then that's it. Does that make sense? But some of the ways you're saying is you're on the right track. So what's your answer? Anybody? What'd you say? 24? So now, what did you mess up? 24 is like something related to the number of people. That would be 75% of the total people here, right? But when they say Q3, they mean that these are test scores. I need to find the test score associated with the 75th percentile. Does that make sense? Not the number of people. The number of people we have to do also. We have to use that. Okay, like that's good that you did that. But the thing is we need not the number. We just say what score. Do you understand what I'm saying? The difference there? Come on, just fractions. 80 is close. Very close. 62, no. 62 is bad. 80 is very close. Okay? It's not the best answer. All right? Some people will tell you it's correct though. But they're wrong. But but 80 is very close. Why? Why are you saying 80? Okay. Why is she doing that? So if there's 32 people here, right? She's saying that 1/4 of those 32 people is 8 people. Is that correct? So we should count down like 8 people. Does that make sense? Which is pretty reasonable, actually. All right. But the thing is though, 80 is not the best answer, but 80 actually satisfies based off the definition that I said earlier. 80 has 3/4 of the data less than. Does everybody see that? Does that make sense? So 80 is actually in the 75th percentile. It's not the best answer though. So you got to make sure you answer the best answer. I'll explain what I'm saying, what the difference is in 1 second. All right. But this is the way I want you to answer the question on the test. All right. Or on your homeworks or whatever. So like if we call this X1 and we call this X2 and we call this X3, etc., and then this I guess would be X32. Does everybody see that? And this is what, X24 and that's X25. Is that right? Right? It's true that the 75th percentile is the number that has 24 data points less than it in this case. Does that make sense? Because we need to have our fraction be 24 out of 32. That gives us 0.75. Is that right? All right. So what I always tell people to do is write like this. You have percentage is equal to the number divided by the total. Does that make sense? The number then is always equal to the percentage times the total, right? You should know that. If you say percentage of something, it just means percent. You just convert to percentage and then change to multiplication. Is that correct? Of means multiply. Is that right? So if I say to you like 75% of the 32 people, right? That's just 0.75 times 30 duper. Is that correct? So then this is 3/4 times 32. We get 24. Does everybody see that? 75% of the data set is 24 values. That's why I was saying at the beginning that 24 sounds she's going in the right direction. It's not the test score though. Does that make sense? All right, great. We start counting 24, right? We get to this guy here. Does everybody see that? All right. Now her answer is really, really, really close to being correct. All right. It has 75% of the data less than it. It doesn't have 25% of the data greater than it. Does that make sense? All right. So the thing is that this number right here and that number right there, we're a little confused now. We know it has to be somewhere around there. Does that make sense? Right? So if I want three-quarters less than it and 1/4 greater than it, right? Because that would be the best thing we could pick for the 75th percentile. Is that right? So what's the number that separates the lower 75% of the numbers from the upper 25% of the numbers? It's going to have to be between 79 and 80. Is that correct? So what we're allowed to do for these questions is we're allowed to pick for the answers X23, X24, X25, X26, any of the numbers in the data set, but we're also allowed to pick the numbers between these numbers. Does that make sense? So in this case, we could pick the number between 79 and 80. $79.5 is correct. So 79.5 is the best answer. 79.5 splits the data set into 3/4 less than it, 1/4 greater than it. Is that correct? Question? Does that make sense, guys? Now, the easiest way to remember this when doing the actual problems for your quizzes or tests or anything like that is just to do what we were just doing just now. Find the number of values less, which just means take the percentile and multiply times n. Does that make sense? Then all you ever do is round up to the nearest 0.5. So for instance, what I call this number right here, the number between x23 and x24, I call it x23.5. The number between x24 and x25, I call it x24.5. The number between x25 and x26, I call it x25.5. Does that make sense? All right, I think it'll make sense with the next example when we do the next one. Does everybody understand what I'm saying so far? All right. The test scores of 40 students are listed below. Find P85er, right? Somebody explain me, what should we do, please? Somebody tell me where we start.
Find the total number of dropping less than.
Okay,
So I find that in
so how do we do that?
the x over 40.
X over 40. That's fine. The thing is I'd rather you think about it the way I'm saying it from before, okay? All we need to do is say 85% of the data should be less. Is that correct? You have to know how to calculate percentage. Screw this class, screw the school. You need to know how to calculate percentage. Does everyone understand what I'm saying? All right, you need to know how to do it because of your bank account. You need to know how to do it because of every single restaurant or place you go to when they screw up your bill. All right. You have to know how to do this. Okay. 85%, and it's not hard. That's why we need to know how to do it. Does that make sense? So 85%, you just convert it to a decimal. That's easy. Anybody can do that. Move the thing 2 places over. Is that right? All you have to do is remember that all means multiply. That's it. So if I say 85% of the 40, this just means 0.85 times 40. Anybody can do that. Does that make sense? All right. 0.85 is the same thing as 17 out of 20. 17 out of 20 times 40 is 34. Does that make sense? You can just do it on a calculator. Does that make sense? Question? But I'm telling you, everything is easier with fractions. All right. People think fractions aren't easier. That's just because you had some teacher that, I don't know, didn't want to force you. All right. But the thing is, if I force you to, you'll start telling me fractions are easy. All right. If we start doing it that way. Yep.
So
We're not done yet, though. Go ahead. What's your question? No, so am I. So am I. So what's the answer? 83. That's a bad answer. Why would you say 83? Because 83 only has 32 numbers less than it. Is that correct? Does that make sense what I'm saying? But I was counting how many numbers there were. There were 24 numbers. 75% of 32 was 24. 85% of 40 is 34, right? So which number should we pick? 84, no. '89 is close again, but it's not the best one again. It needs to be between 85 and 89. Okay? 87. So why? All right, 34 numbers need to be less than my number. Is that correct? All right, well, that's good. That part we can do. That's all that crap. Is that right? Now, what did I say for this next thing here? Round up to the nearest 0.5. Does everybody see that? So round up to the nearest number that's divisible by 0.5. All right. In other words, if we rounded this up, it would now be 34.5. Is that correct? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Why am I doing that? So that now I include that 34th value in the other set. Does that make sense? So then you just got to pick the number that's the next 0.5. Okay. So for instance, if we had gotten that the number of numbers was 17.1, oh, we would pick the 17.5th number. If we had gotten 17.5, we would have to go up to the 18th number. Does that make sense? If we pick the 17.9th number, we would pick the 18th number. 18th number has 17.9 numbers less than it. Is that correct? Does that make sense? Question with this? So in this case, the answer is 87. Question? Sorry? You have to pick the 17.5 number. That's correct. All right? Does it make sense why? Because if you say 17.1 is 85% of the data, right? Here, I like to think about it this way also. If you go into a store and you need $17.1 to buy the thing, right? Can you buy it with 17? Can you buy it with $17.50? Yes, you can. Could you buy it with 18? You could, but you don't need 18. Does that make sense? So the best amount of money that I could bring to that store would be $17.50 if I was only allowed to do every 50 cents. Does that make sense? Question? $20th? I'll show you. It doesn't matter. You don't have to do that though. Okay? You don't really need to know how to do that. Like if you just go here and you click calculator, you just do 0.85 times, what was it, 40? And it gives you the answer. All right. It's just I think it makes more sense the other way. But 0.85 is the same thing as 85 over 100. Is that correct? So then these things, 5 is divisible by both of these, right? So 5 goes into this thing, 17 times? 5 goes into this thing 20 times. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right, let's do one more, and then that's all I really have. Okay. All right, let's do, I don't know, pick a number that's not a nice number, and let's try and find that percentile. Okay. So percentile, what percentile do you want to find? 33. So she's a bad student. She's mean. No, that's a good suggestion. Okay, so the let's say we want to find P33. You understand why I'm saying that? The weirder the number it is, if we know how to do that, we'll know how to do all of them. Is that correct? All right, so P33. How are we going to do this? Explain me. What do I do first? Percentage of what? Of the 40, right? Because we need to find out what the 33% of the 40 actually is. Is that correct? Does that make sense, guys? All right, how are we going to do that? What you going to do? Just multiply 33 times 40, then move the decimal point over. Does that make sense? So 4 times 3 is what? 12. 4 times 3 is, so what? 132? Does that make sense? 13.2. So we have 13.2 numbers. That's true. You're already doing the next step though, but you're correct. So so then the thing is first I want to do 0.33 times 40, right? I think that's 13.2. But he just did the next step correctly, so we might as well do what he said. So then this thing, we round this up to 13.5. Is that correct? Now what do we do though? Yeah, find the average of the one above it. That's correct. Perfect. Maybe you should teach the class. All right, good, good. Say it one time. Okay, because look, this is the part, don't screw this part up. This is the part that I would mess up, okay? Because I'll calculate it correctly, and then I'll sit here and be like, oh, I'm done, and I go do this, and I count it wrong, all right? There's 10 here, 11, 12, 13, 14. This has to be between the 13th and 14th terms. Is that correct? So this means this is going to be what? 63 plus 65 are divided by a duper, so we get 60. Does that make sense? Question here, guys? Hopefully that helps a little bit. All right. But there's not really that much stuff that you have to calculate for the first chapter. So the only thing you really have to understand now also is what's a frequency distribution? Some of these words I was talking about earlier, relative frequency, some of this stuff about mean, median, mode, standard deviation, and then we talk about z-score and relative position, and then a little bit about what a normal distribution is. All right, and that's all chapter 3. Okay. Question? No, you can request it over there. Why? What's the difference? Yeah, you can request it anywhere. If you have any trouble, just let me know. Tell me which lab you're at, and I'll call them. They don't like listening to me because I really get mad at these people. But but no, I don't think they'll give you trouble. Honestly, I gotta tell you, the math labs, they're usually some pretty good people. Most of these people, they don't get paid very much, and they sit there all day long trying to help people. You know what I mean?